Campo, and I'm here to present my CSE 335 project, what I'm calling DataDoc. So the idea behind the project is to provide some sort of diagnostic evaluation to people who provide data about their symptoms. So we know that diagnostic criteria that doctors use in order to evaluate whether someone is sick or not is readily available, right? They're just checklists that say, if X, Y, Z is met, then this person is likely to have this ailment. Well, um, we know that many doctor's visits actually end up being unnecessary if the criteria is not met and the doctor does not actually diagnose the patient with any sort of specific cause. So the goal of DataDoc is to identify medical issues based on symptoms. So symptoms can come from a lot of different places, and so the most obvious one is the user actually just telling us, maybe I have trouble sleeping or I have pain in my lower back. So that's something that we can actually solicit to users who are willing to give it um, through a small quiz, and if they're interested in learning more about symptoms that may indicate that they have certain health issues, then we can use that data in order to evaluate it. But I think where this idea is really interesting is that in the future, this could include things such as wearables or the HealthKit API within iOS, or even other doctors who could use it to update a medical profile. If we keep a running tally of all the symptoms that a person has at any given moment, we can provide a list of potential health issues that they may be encountering and the probability of each of them. And lastly, because this is an iOS application, we can also incorporate location into this by referring them to a medical professional near them using MapKit and core location. So this class diagram is a little small, so I'll move into a bigger one. The idea behind this is that we have three things that we're really modeling as data. Okay, so we have first the diagnosis. So the diagnosis consists of a name and an ID and a description, as well as a list of symptoms associated with that diagnosis and a list of suggestions that the user has not completed yet. Based on this, we can also derive a few different things, such as what type of professional we would want to send this user to if this diagnosis is true or positive, and what ratio of symptoms the user has given us. So the diagnosis is dependent on two things, or contains two things. First is a number of symptoms, and symptoms are what we actually store into core data. And in core data, we store everything the user has told us about whether a symptom is positive or negative. So every time the user loads it up, we scan through, or we load all of their symptoms, and then we scan through a list of possible health issues, and then we perform kind of a diagnostic run that says, based on the symptoms you've told us that you have positive or negative, here's the diagnosis that we think is appropriate for you. We also store in core data suggestions, which really in this main app there are two main types of suggestions. First is to see a medical professional, and two is to provide us with more diagnostic information. So, but that could be expanded in the future, and we have an easily extensible class here in core data that could allow you to do that. We also store the suggestions that the user has already completed so that we don't show it every time we load the app. So that's kind of the data model, but we also have a local model class where we keep kind of the state of the application, which is a list of diagnoses, and that has been checked for basically what symptoms, what's the likelihood, and what suggestions do we still have for them. So this is kind of a static diagnosis list that is globally used among screens. So if we look at the view controllers and the controllers in the application, well, we have two tabs at the bottom for two different view controllers. The first is suggestions, and the second is a list of diagnoses. So the suggestions one, as I said, has a list of unchecked off suggestions, such as visiting doctors and providing more information. And the diagnosis one is how you get into the diagnosis detail view. And when you get into the diagnosis detail view, you can receive a description of the health issue that you're looking at, the probability that you have it based on the symptoms you've described to us, and the option to move into a diagnostic test, which is the kind of yes or no quiz that you can use to input data. We also, either from the detail view controller or the suggestions list, we can go into a map controller, which uses the Google Maps and Google Places API to search for nearby doctors who specialize in treating that health issue nearby, and then renders it in a map view so that the user can contact the local clinic. So we'll move on and describe how this fits into the model view controller diagram. So in this case, as I mentioned, the model is going to store the user's suggestions and entered symptoms into core data. We also manage data for the diagnoses and a schema for ailments to diagnose. So what that means is that the user's symptoms and suggestions that they've done are stored long-term, but we're also maintaining a state, which is basically the list of diagnoses, and that's rendered at runtime and can also be easily added. We can add new diagnosis objects into this list with new elements that you can add if you want to extend the functionality. For the purposes of this app, I've only included 3 different ones, but obviously that can be extended. Now the controller is actually handling all of the application logic, so that includes calculating the probability and percentage of diagnosis, now sending diagnostic data to the model, updating the views of new data, making API calls to Google Maps and Places, and calculating what percentage of symptoms have been accounted for. And of course, the view, as we know, is supposed to react to user interaction, so that's displaying diagnoses, suggestions, the map view with nearby treatments, as well as providing an interface for users to input new symptoms. So on the right here, you can see what the map view looks like, and that's one of the main features. We store the user's symptoms and suggestions, and we can find nearby health professionals using the Google Maps and Places API. I kind of mentioned these capabilities, but a couple limitations that I think could be good for the future is that the user input is the source of the data, so we don't have HealthKit support. But HealthKit collects data from all of the wearables and different apps that are supported by the iOS and puts it into one place. So if we enable support in that, perhaps in a future version, that's a slew of data that can help us diagnose things early on and help prevent people from suffering from health issues. That is easily available, and as far as I know, is not really being used to diagnose things ahead of time, and could really help a lot of doctors out if they had access to that. Also, we don't have searching and sorting of the elements. They're right now listed in a list view, but they're not really sorted, and the list view doesn't have custom cells that really provide any more information besides the name. So that's another limitation that I would really like to implement in a future version. So lessons learned, and this is on the side, an example of the suggestions page, which tells you, which is a list of, in this case there's only 2 sample ones, either to see the professional or to provide criteria, but shows you here that you can switch between tabs, where home is a list of the health issues and suggestions is a list of what you should do in order to correct them. The lessons learned, the big one is the difference between state and data, because in core data we're actually storing the symptoms that the user is given and suggestions, but that's not necessarily the same as storing the state of the app. As the user is using the application, yes, we are storing data back there, such as the symptoms and suggestions, but we also want to maintain a sense of, what are the actual list of elements that we're loading and rendering, and what are the percentage and ratios of suggestions that are changing over time as the user is using the app. So that makes modeling data more complex than expected, right? Because when I thought at first, okay, so a sickness probably just has a name and a description, I didn't realize that it also should maybe have a unique identifier, and should actually contain a list of symptoms and ailments, and that requires a more complex data model than maybe one might expect. Since you are actually mixing data that is maintained locally as state and data that is long-term in the core data. Also, I learned that there are different options for making API calls offered by Google Maps. They actually offer an SDK, which is a module actually installed via CocoaPods, or they also offer a web service, which is a JSON web service, much like your landing class. I ended up using the JSON web service because we had used it in class and I had experience with it, and I wanted to keep it kind of dependency free so that the grader could grade it. But the SDK actually provides a lot of really nice helper classes that would make working with the map and getting data from Google much easier. And on this last screen, you have the on the right, the test. This is what it looks like to input new symptoms. So in this case, it's cataplexy. Gives you a brief description of the symptom, asks you if you identify with this criteria or you can skip it, and tells you, how many of the criteria for this health issue have you given us so that we can make the evaluation. So for improvements, I would like to work on integrating HealthKit. As I said before, I think this is really one of the big selling points. If there's all this data already out there and we can gain access to it, that would be amazing for early diagnosis and prevention of health issues that could really save a lot of lives. So I wasn't able to include that due to time constraints, but that's something that would be a huge feature that would be one of the main selling points of this app. I think this has the potential, with improvements to the UI and usability, to maybe working on the design more, especially the potential to monetize this. Health suggestions might run. Right now, it's just seeing a professional or giving more data, but perhaps downloading other apps that can help the user collect data about their health could be advertised or suggested, as well as local clinics that could maybe pay, to say, okay, we're a sponsor of this, and we want to be shown prominently on the map, for example. And so, yeah, all in all, this is a really great project for thinking about project architecture. I really had to think very thoroughly about the MVC, and especially how I was going to organize the classes in this application. It is also a really good opportunity to work on modeling state and data within an iOS application, especially when it can grow very complex, and also to figure out a way to make it extensible so that anybody can add new symptoms and health issues over time, so that over time we kind of build this great database. And actually, another improvement that I thought of that isn't on here would be to actually pull some of the health issues from maybe an online database and some of the diagnostic criteria and see if we can automate something like that, maybe pulling from something like WebMD online or an EMR software. So overall, I enjoyed the project and I was able to accomplish all the functionality that I wanted to. And it's a project that, like any other application, I can keep continuing and would like to improve on in the future. And had a really interesting time working on it. Thank you.